To the 2016 Ake Festival. We've got a book chat with, on my left, Panache Chigumadze from Zimbabwe and South Africa, and on my right, Chinelo Okparanta from Nigeria, well, and the US. I'm going to let both writers talk about themselves for a minute, and then I would allow them to read from their books. Panache's book is called Sweet Medicine, and Chinelo's book is called Under the Udala Trees. Now, Panache, I'll start with you. Can you just say something about yourself briefly before I move to Chinelo?
Okay, I'm tempted to read my bio at the back of the book. So as she said, my name is Panache Chigumadze. I was born in Zimbabwe, Harare, and I grew up in South Africa. I am a novelist. I also write essays, so I contribute to a number of platforms, sort of both in South Africa, some of the national newspapers, as well as some of international newspapers that I've also contributed to. And of course, fiction is something that I'm very interested in, doing short stories as well as this being my debut novel. So basically, I think I'd challenge the interviewer to ask us a little bit more if you'd like to more about me.
Well, later, not now. Later, not now. Chinelo?
My name is Chinelo Okparanta. I'm from Nigeria here. I was born in Port Harcourt and moved to the US when I was young, though I am still young, I suppose. I am the author of a book of short stories called Happiness Like Water and a novel called Under the Udala Trees, as she said. And I'm happy to be here.
Thank you very much. Now we're going to have both writers read from their work. First, it will be Panache. You've got about 5 minutes. We have an hour. I know we're running late, so I don't know if they will try to cut us off quickly today. So you've got like 5 minutes to do a short reading, and then Chinelo will do hers, and then the questions will start.
I just want to say I'm happy to be here too, and I'm even happier to eat your food. As I always say, having read a lot of the food in a lot of the Nigerian literature, like jollof rice, I make a very good jollof rice at home. My version, my South African Zimbabwean version of jollof rice, I think will give you, I would say it's probably better than Ghanaian and Nigerian jollof, but. Ask Lola if we can have a food challenge, and then you'll see. No food challenge? No? Okay.
You lose, you go home crying.
Okay, so this is from Sweet Medicine, and very briefly, it's the story of a young woman by the name of Tsitsi, and as my blurb says, she seeks economic and romantic security through what we might call otherworldly means, and this is at the height of Zimbabwe's economic downturn around the 2008 period, so that's where you might want to locate yourself. If you have a copy of the book, I'm reading from page 123. 123.
1, 2, 3.
Cool. Zrobo, the father, now remarked to his daughter that his harem of women had left him, and offered a gentle laugh. It sounded as if she had laughed too, before putting her mother on the phone. He spoke with a kind of familiarity that caused Tsitsi to feel a sense of resentment. To her mind, she had driven them apart in physical distance, but they nonetheless seemed tied to one another by the physical manifestations of their marriage. If Tsitsi were honest, she had been surprised by the relative ease of it all. Chiedza had been surprised too. Chokwadinde chekuti, Mrs. Zrobo is definitely a better woman than I am. I always say, if an unclassy situation happens to me, then I reserve the right to unclassy actions, petrol, matchsticks, and all. A woman like Mrs. Robo one of such stature, with such a name, to divorce so easily? Chiedza had read in the papers that she had been the one to have filed the papers, that he had been the one to initially refuse to give his signature, that she had threatened him if he didn't. With what? Tsitsi didn't know. Drobo had not spoken to her of this. He had made it seem as if it were all his choice. His choice to begin taking care of her family. His choice to promote her from the status of small house. His choice to have her become the woman of his house. His choice to endure the initial disproving and disparaging looks. She saw their looks. But Drobo, they said, you're not the first to have a small house. We have our own, but we don't go and chase out our wives, the mothers of our children, in order to put these small houses in the main house. If you really didn't want to have to continue playing truant with your wife, why didn't you just make the young girl your second wife? Their eyes would ask until they would later be duly informed that Mrs. Drobo would not have had any of it. To which they would respond that it was perhaps because she had been spoiled by the fact that he, a man of his stature, had been so good before. To which the informant would have a hearty chuckle, to which the other would in turn respond, besides, was it not her degrees that had gone to her head? To which the other would answer, I think it's the kind of family she came from. Very proud. Her father used to own businesses in Chitungwiza. He also had the Tingamira buses all those years. He sent all of his children, all girls, to school. Primary school right up until university, all of those girls. To which the other would question, was she not one of those party women who made a noise about having to wombera and welcomed the men ministers at the airport as they returned from overseas visits? To which the other would respond, no, but in any case, wasn't she supposed to become the Minister of Women Affairs, Gender, Community Development, and all things considered unimportant in the greater scheme of things when there was that fallout with the first minister? To which the other would confirm, yes, that was before her arrogance got in her way and she caused some trouble in the department. A very arrogant woman that. Yes, even during the Chimurenga, we warned against that sort of bourgeois imperialist feminism, women's lib what of hers. To which they would then both agree. With all of this to have had to put up with, perhaps it was understandable that the old man had put the small house in the main house. Poor old man. In no time, they agreed, they would have a child and all this would be forgotten. Eventually, Tsitsi believed, it all had become his choice, although at times she would find him looking at old pictures of the two of them, the ones she would eventually throw out, and at times when he was particularly forgetful, he would call her Rudo. But that was not grounds to be unhappy with the relationship, as long as he was there. He was there and providing. She could accept the situation. She could accept the situation, whereas Mrs. Drobo could not. Mrs. Drobo was not an undivorceable woman, not an undivorceable woman who would refuse to see that she was no longer wanted, that he had a new life. No, she was not an undivorceable woman who would defiantly continue to wear her wedding ring, continue to wear hers, even when he had long since stopped wearing his. No, she was not an undivorceable woman who could forgive her husband's sins for the sake of a name that was revered for its bravery in the second and third Chimurengas. No, she was not an undivorceable woman who could forgive her husband's sins of the flesh and others for the sake of sanctity, the sanctity of a holy union. No, she was not an undivorceable woman who could forgive her husband's sins for the sake of family, for the sake of a family that would too have its fair share of its own open secrets, children in the bush, incest, small houses, bruised bodies, and the like. No, she was not an undivorceable woman who would appeal to his family, first to Tete and then his brothers, and if alive, the mother, who in this case was not. Appeal to his family so that they would in turn appeal to their dear but misguided brother, son. No, she was not an undivorceable woman who could bring out dockets of her years as a good murora to the family, a good murora who was always hardworking and, very importantly, humble. A good murora who had dutifully looked after their sick mother before she had died, a good murora who had been a mother to all his siblings and the many other relatives who had needed a halfway house of sorts when they had come to town from the village. No, she was not an undivorceable woman who was going to produce any dockets in public either. No dockets that contained details of the many properties acquired through impropriety at his job. No, she was not an undivorceable woman. The ex-Mrs. Robo, Miss Rudo Tingamira, was in fact a very divorceable woman. Yes, she was in fact a very divorceable woman who took off her wedding ring and, in turn, had her ex-husband, Mr. Robo, the almost undivorceable man, had it not been for her divorceableness, discover just how divorceable he was.
And now we will hear from Chinelo.
So I'll read from page 234 of the hardcover. And where you did 1, 2, 3. I'll do 2, 3, 4, and it was not planned. Okay, so I don't know if any of you, maybe some of you, do know the story of Ijoma, and I will read her first night of marriage. I acknowledge to myself that sometimes I am a snail. I move myself by gliding. I contract my muscles and produce a slime of tears. Sometimes you see the tears and sometimes you don't. It is my tears that allow me to glide. I glide slowly, but slowly I glide. It is a while before I am gone. That first night of our marriage, I was a snail. We were all of us once snails. In the beginning, we had stayed with Mama in Aba, and we had slept in my room just for that first month of marriage, that 1 month space before Chibundu got the Port Harcourt job. Mama had found a second twin bed and mattress and pushed them together so that they appeared to be a double bed. She had spread new sheets that she had purchased as our wedding gift. This is how our first night together went. Imagine a snail protected by its hard shell. Imagine a snail when it is alarmed. Imagine the snail retreating into its shell. That first night, Chibundu called me to him. He was wearing remnants of his tuxedo, the tie, the white shirt, the trousers. He sat on the edge of the mattress. I went to him, sat by his side. No alarm yet. You've made me a very happy man, he said, leaning over, wrapping his arm around me. He leaned in further, began to kiss me. I allowed him to do so. There's no more complete happiness than the one I'm feeling now, he said between kisses. Look at me. I feel like I can fly. A slight bit of alarm was rising in me now. Go ahead and fly, I wanted to say. Go ahead and fly so long as you land far enough away from me. Instead, I said, we should try and get some sleep. He laughed, not disrespectfully, almost appreciatively for the sexual banter he perceived was going on. Now, wow, he said, women and their teasing. But of course, Ijoma, you do know that sleep is the very last thing on my mind. He made a sudden movement with his hands, and I watched as he began tugging at the front of his trousers. Then came that dreaded sound, just the sound of a man undoing his zipper, but it was as if a sharp object had somehow been jabbed into my ears. A room full of alarm-like fog clouding up the atmosphere. I pulled away so that there was at least a 4 arms length of space between us. I folded my hands across my chest, looked up at the ceiling, not wanting to look at him. Uniform tiles formed large squares above, gray like the paint on the walls. Some time passed, a few more minutes. I lowered my folded arms from my chest, took his hand in mine. Sometimes a story reminds you of a painting. And each time I tell this story, I see that old painting of a beach. As your skies melting into a lighter shade of blue, melting into the pastel yellow of the disappearing sun, melting back into a sea-colored blue. A glass-looking slab of wood near the edge of the earth where brown and sea blue meet. There is a mountain range, craggy rocks peeking in from the right side of the painting, and in the foreground, there is the darkness of the cacao-colored earth. The painting would be almost unremarkable if not for the rest of the objects in it. A plain-looking brown box, like a trunk. From the trunk, a growth like a cancer, a stump of a tree, branches and all, but no leaves. There I was, holding Chibundu's hand, and as I held it, the words came to me. Too much ceremony has a way of taking the life, of taking the joy out of what is being celebrated. The next thing I knew, Chibundu was staring at me with a look of shock on his face. I put down his hand, returned my hands to my sides. His eyes were steady on me, careful eyes, as if he were looking at some strange, new, unexpected version of me. And of course, to him, he was. I left him where he sat, walked over to the window, stayed by the window, still in my wedding gown, and every once in a while, a breeze blew in through the open space. In the few instances that the breeze was strong, I pushed my face into it as if it would somehow blow away my agony. And even when I heard Chibundu's soft snoring, I continued to stand by the window wide awake. Only when the sky had turned from black to gray, only when I could hear the distant crowing of the roosters and hens, did sleep finally come to me. I struggled, undid the zipper of my wedding gown, stepped out of it. The knock came just as I had put on my nightgown. I opened the door to Mama, standing with her wrapper tied across her chest, wearing a bright smile. "Come, come," she said, waving me toward her and out of the room. "Come, you must tell me. How was it?" "How was what, Mama?" "Mwanka," she said, feigning exasperation. This child, but there was a hint of a smile on her face. "How was what, Mama?" she said, mimicking me. "Of course, you know what I'm asking. How was your first night as a wife?" I shook my head at her, embarrassed that she should even ask. "Mama, I've barely slept." "Of course not." Her smile widened. "It's no surprise that you've hardly slept. All that happiness." Happiness was what she called it. But I knew that happiness was a word like madness, like sickness, like confusion, like loss, like death. Even like beautiful or pure or angelic or God, happiness was a word that represented some deeper, inexplicable, heavy idea, the kind of idea that goes back and forth between two different worlds. Thank you.
Now we go to the questions. Again, I'll start with you, Panache, if you don't mind. In Sweet Medicine, you take the reader on a journey of shattered dreams and expectations. Titi got a degree with the hopes of bettering the life of herself, her mom, and her uncle, only for the economic collapse of Zimbabwe to begin thwarting her aspirations. How does this reflect the reality in today's Zimbabwe? And what is the present generation of youth doing to fight back?
Well, I think as I write, it's not really my intention to ask that question in terms of what we're doing to fight back, or rather, I'm interested in sort of the interiority, sort of what we go through, because I think sometimes, particularly with heavily politicized backgrounds or heavily politicized milieus, to use that word, such as Zimbabwe, sometimes we forget about people, and people are really just a vehicle to talk about Zimbabwean, we don't really care for what happens in the day-to-day sort of experience of people, and that was something that I was more interested in. And I think that's sort of looking at, that's particularly what I'm more interested in right now. And even in, I don't live in Zimbabwe, but going back and forth and sort of going through the kind of conversations that I might have with a lot of my family members, and there's the easy sort of surface level answers that we can give about, oh, how are things? And someone can give you the sort of the breakdown of, oh, yesterday, inflation went up by this and this much, or, this is what's happening with the currency. But I think very few of us would really ask, how are you? Beyond sort of how are things, and then there's how are you in this situation? Particularly because I think there's something that I sort of try to reflect in the book is we often deflect through humor. So there's a lot of within every couple months, there's a new way, there's a new kind of joke or something, and the way in which people express sort of almost the ridiculousness of the situation. And that's almost a way that which people don't have to deal with some of the very personal aspects, the personal disappointments that come as a result of sort of the big political questions. And I think that is something that I was more interested in, is as the situation forces you into certain compromises that you didn't think you had to make, what does that begin to look like for you, and how do you, I think something as Chinelo mentioned in her reading, the idea of you starting to look, or someone starting to look different than you had thought, and how you start looking different to yourself is something that I'm most interested in, and sort of what the difference in your self-image, particularly if, I think Nigeria might be similar in the idea of hard work, education will give you a particular kind of future. And I think across the world we're seeing that that's not quite what happens. If you do X, then Y will happen. What happens when Z is the answer? How do you begin to look differently as yourself? And I think that's what I've been more interested in, as opposed to being able to give a social anthropological answer about how are Zimbabweans, or what are the youth today doing about XYZ sort of issue.
Okay. Thank you for that. Then I have a question for Chinelo. Chinelo, in the author's note of your book, you wrote that your novel attempts to give Nigeria's LGBTQ citizens a more powerful voice and a place in our nation's history. Why do you think this is important? Well, it's like 3 questions in one, to be honest. Why do you think it's important to do this? And did you fear any backlash might come your way for writing this book? Also, how did your family and friends receive your book?
Okay, so it is 3 questions in one, so you have to remind me of the other 2. But I'll say, when I wrote this novel, I don't write because people tell me what to write. I write because I have something I have a need to express. And so I wrote the book because I had a need to express something that was important to me. When it was published, it's interesting, the response from the Western world was very different from the response from Africa, or from at least the communities of African writers and African people who are not writers that I know of. So the Western audiences tended to say to me, we have moved on, we are so far ahead from Africa. So this is just, a struggle that we went through in the 1960s, the 1970s, but anyway, Africa is behind. In Africa, the response that I got, and of course I cannot speak for the entire continent of Africa, but from the people that I spoke with, many of them said to me, don't bring that Western disease to us. Do not let yourself be brainwashed by the West. So for those sorts of reasons, which of course this was happening even before the book was published, I thought it was important to put that little note, the author's note, because I felt that there are people here on the ground who would benefit from a book speaking to their experiences. With all the people who on both sides are shutting down this community. It's interesting that the community is being shut down by both sides, both the Western world and the African world, and I thought it was an important conversation for us to have in literature. Interestingly enough, I don't actually believe Africa is behind. I do believe that many of us in Africa do tend to worship the ideas of the West, because before the West decided that homosexuality was a sin, I don't think anybody in Africa, based on my research, actually thought it was a sin. I mean, if any of us did the research, our own cultures were not against, for instance, women-to-women marriages. My own grandmother was married to another woman. The concept of marriage in itself, it's a whole complicated situation, and it's its own history that maybe we should look into to see what that was about. But in any case, to keep the answer short, I thought it was important for this book to speak to a community that was being rejected on both sides.
Okay, the other two parts were, has there been any backlash? Did you feel any backlash, and how did your family receive the book?
Backlash, I mean, yes, but you know, I'm still living, I'm still alive, so that's good. I used to be on social media, and the backlash that I got, the hardest part for me was when I published my collection of short stories, Happiness Like Water. That collection had 2 short stories that had LGBTQ themes in them, but I did get some messages that were, you know, not the most flattering. They said, "Don't do that in Nigeria, we will kill you," that sort of thing. Some things, some threats are just threats, right? So look at Donald Trump, maybe it's just a threat, I guess we'll find out. Hopefully, when you see me, you see I'm just a person just like you. I'm not threatening in any way, and I think, one love. We all should learn to love ourselves.
Thank you, Chinelo.
Family, should I answer about my family?
If you want to.
Okay, as far as my family goes, what was your question?
How did your family receive the book?
Okay, so actually, my immediate family, all members except one, read the book before it was published. All members of my immediate family have read my collection of short stories, Happiness Like Water. I don't know if I can't remember if my mother read it before or after publication. She certainly read it before it came out into the world, but I don't remember if it was in the process of, having the galleys first. Interestingly enough, there's not been much of a negative reaction recently as to my writing, because my family knows exactly who I am. But one thing that stuck to my mind was my mother's reaction to my collection, Happiness Like Water, and she was reacting, I think, to 2 stories. She was reacting to the story of America and the story of tumors like butterflies. The America story is a fictional story. There are 2 stories in my collection that are strongly autobiographical. The rest are not, or at least not as autobiographical as those 2 stories. Those 2 stories are Shelter and Tumors and Butterflies. But I do think she was reacting to America and also reacting to Tumors and Butterflies, and her reaction was, the world is going to think that I'm a bad mother, which I thought was interesting, because that is an instance in which my mother is negotiating existing in 2 different cultures, right? So in her mind, the most dominant, because that is where she is right now, was that Western culture where she thought she defined it in some way as the world. And I said to her, no, because there's this other large part of the world who will think that a mother who stays in an abusive relationship is doing the right thing, right? There's this other part of the world that says that a mother who says that her child should not fall in love with the person that the child is in love with is doing the right thing. So these are battles that we are in the world constantly negotiating, and sometimes these negotiations are harder for people who live in two different worlds.
Thank you. Back to you, Panache. There seems to be some influence, well, substantial, in your book of Nigeria or Nigerians by the characters. There's the reference to Nollywood and the mimicry that goes on with the Nigerian accent, as well as the way people dress, how they tie their gele, and how to look, well, maybe successful like a big man's wife. And then even up to the pastor who was supposed to have learned under TB Joshua. I just wanted to know, are these kind of influences like what obtains now in Zimbabwe? And do you see it as kind of like, what would I call it? Not so much a global village kind of thing, like the shrinking of our boundaries, in which we pretty much borrow from other cultures and things?
Before I came here, I was speaking to my cousin, and she said, don't forget to bring me, and I thought she meant material, and then she said, no, kola nut. So that being something that she probably would have seen either from TV or through novels, and she thought, that's something I'd like to bring. And it's almost, in some ways, even for me, it's my first time in Nigeria, I find it almost similar. My experience coming into Nigeria was similar to going to America, in the sense of you want to confirm everything you've seen and read about. So you're kind of looking around for all those things you've seen, or the way in which people are and that kind of thing, and you're confirming and unlearning and all of those kind of things. So I think in general, Nigeria looms large for a lot of countries. So of course the Nollywood thing, the DVDs, and I mean, for example, my dad's a doctor, and they usually have Africa Magic, they're playing in the surgery, so people are watching that. It's a good 3 hours of entertainment, part 1, part 2, part 3, you can watch that. Princess Rihanna versus Princess Beyonce, we can all watch that, that kind of thing, and I can probably maybe have an argument about Genevieve versus, Omotola, exactly. And even, I think, where was Dami? As soon as I got here, I was like, please explain to me, what does Ojo Legba mean, right? And then, because, WizKid has sort of gotten very big in South Africa, so, that kind of thing as well. We are also becoming far more, in South Africa, particularly, because South Africa likes to think it's not part of the continent. So it's been interesting to also watch South Africa begin to take in Nigeria, okay, this is just pop culture here. Bonang and Dibanj and all of those things have also helped in South Africa, at least, to warm us up a lot more to Nigeria. And of course, from a literature perspective, it looms large as well. So there's the huge sort of, cultural imperialism of Nigeria there. And there's the thing about Nigerian men, all of those different kinds of things, that people would like to do. But I think very seriously, particularly in, within Zimbabwe as well, something, for example, we don't have traditional outfits or traditional wear as Shona people, particularly in Zimbabwe. So, i.e., it's either loincloth or traditional Western wear. So when we talk about traditional clothing, it's maybe this sort of thing, or it becomes the appropriation or the assimilation of a lot of West African. When we talk about African attire, it typically means sort of that sort of Nigerian, sort of the gele and that kind of thing, and people bring the patterns and that kind of thing. And I think, so that's something that's happened. But I think as well, what you see throughout the book is a lot of other African countries beyond Nigeria that are in the book. So of course, South Africa looms large, particularly from an economic perspective, people coming to South Africa, and you see that kind of change in how people behave and that kind of thing. But also another big country that we don't really talk about a lot is the DRC, and that influence, particularly around music. So a song that was throughout the book is called, was by Leonard Rakata, and that song particularly we have a type of music called Sungura. And Sungura comes from sort of Central Eastern Africa, and that also has to do with, when we fought in the DRC in the late 90s, as well as sort of the sort of inter-country sort of migration there, as people would go there and bring back the music. So that kind of influence has been there as we have been traveling amongst ourselves as Africans, and we trade amongst ourselves, and those influences then end up coming through in our sort of local culture. So I think that's a lot of it. I think Nigeria is the most obvious. If you go to our supermarkets, South Africa is the most obvious. And maybe if you look at our currency, the US is the most obvious, but there's other ways in which other African countries also begin to sort of come through in how we do things and in our everyday sort of culture.
Okay, thank you. Another quick question. With your character, how did you decide to come by Sisi and her struggles and the decision to cleave on to or seduce an older, rich, married man as opposed to hustling like a friend for the money? Was that like a conscious thing, or is this something that you've seen happen often? Why did you decide to take that track with her?
I think Titi came by mistake, or her story really came by mistake, because I was actually more interested in the question of religion and our traditional beliefs. I think, particularly, at least for us in Southern Africa, we often do not like to, sort of the idea of the dichotomy between the heathens and those of us who are Christians and who are civilized and that kind of thing. And so I was interested, particularly in my household where I grew up, I was only raised in a very strictly Christian background. I didn't know anything about our traditional beliefs, and particularly, the idea of witches and that kind of thing, until I was about maybe 12, and that was through cousins trying to scare you at night and not wanting you to switch off the light and that kind of thing. But I was also interested in, okay, why is it that it's almost like when we decide to finally go to the Sangoma or the Nyanga, it's almost as if it's a last resort type of thing. So when things really, really do not work out, that's where we go to. But in terms of saving face and going to town, I'm a Christian woman, these are my ideals and that kind of thing, and that kind of respectability. Zimbabwe is a very heavily Christian society, and I was interested in seeing how different people, and I think, thinking of it from a very structural perspective, thinking about how when things fall apart in a country, with neoliberalism, the kinds of traditions and kinds of Christianities that are becoming very popular. So right now, I remember it was Christmas at my family home in the rural areas, and inside, the women were praying, and it was an all-day Christmas prayer and that kind of thing. And outside, the men were getting drunk out of their minds, right? So it was like sort of how different people deal with sort of the difficulty happening right now. So because the women are not allowed to be getting drunk out of their minds, they must go to church. And because maybe it might not be seen as masculine enough to go that side. So I was interested in that, and so it was almost incidental. And Titi was someone I judged a lot, and I was just like, oh my God, what kind of a woman is this, blah, blah, blah. And now I'm like, I would like my own Zobo. It would make my writing life much easier to have, an older man who can look after my affairs while I write and all of those kind of things. I'm very seriously, it was just the point about understanding what happens, because I think for a lot of people, it's very scandalous for a woman to be choosing to be seducing an older man. But it happens a lot, and we also need to understand why that happens. And I was interested in that kind of the other woman's story, because we always hear about the woman who was cheated on. I was interested in what about the woman who, cheats. Yeah.
Thank you. Back to you, Chinelo. Your book, like Patricia Highsmith's The Price of Salt, or also known as Carol, kind of has a happy ending. Like in the past, they had said, although since there have been good books with good endings on like same-sex relationships and all, your book is one of those books. Now, the Ijeoma's mother was deeply religious. And towards the end, you find that she becomes kind of accepting or resigned to the kind of person Ijeoma is. What do you think Sorry. What do you have to say about I know you mentioned it before, about the often repeated sayings like, oh, this way of life is us taking our mimicry or copying of the Western cultures too far, and that it has no place in Africa, in Nigeria. What do you have to say to that? And also, I know it seems I'm always asking you more than one question. What role do you think religion has played? And when I mean religion, I mean like the imported religion like Christianity, Islam, has played in the way sex relationships and gay people, the LGBTQ people, are viewed generally in Nigeria and extensively in Africa.
So by one of those books, do you mean one of the books that end happily, or?
Yeah. I mean, before Patricia Highsmith's book, all the same-sex relationships, everything ended badly, almost like Brokeback Mountain, although that was like a short story, but it never ended well because nobody expected anything good to come out of such relationships.
Okay. Well, I don't know Patricia Smith. I guess I haven't read enough same-sex books, or any, except my own. But no, I'm just kidding. I've read Brokeback Mountain. Let's see. So what do I think about the ending of making it a happy ending? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, I said that a lot of people go around saying, oh, this is an important thing and it has no business being here.
Right.
So how do you respond to that, one? Mm-hmm. And do you think that with time we can achieve a situation in which even if people are not happy for the couple, mm-hmm. they would not be put in a situation where they are like threatened with violence or death? Mm-hmm. So I would like to know your views on that.
Yeah. Well, my view is yes, of course. 20 minutes left, by the way. So of course, you already know my stance that the book ends happily, essentially because it needs a happy ending. A story like this should have a happy ending. It is not the ultimate happy ending in the sense that, people are still having to hide who they are. I do hope that there will come a time when we will, as a society, will see people as just people. Let's see. I guess, the situation with religion is the reason why many bad things in the world happen, but there's a reason why people need religion. People need something to believe. People need some kind of organizing force in their lives. People need, we have all these churches. The earlier panel was talking about how this is a country where we have more churches than we have hospitals or something to that effect. I think it's because people need hope. People need a reason to be hopeful, right? And so that is why many of us ran, to Christianity when Christianity came. We abandoned our own traditional religions and we ran to Christianity. Interestingly enough, those are the same people who are telling me, and people like me, to not let themselves be brainwashed by the West, right? And I'm like, well, let's talk about brainwashing and the origin of that. Now, some people will say that Christianity was already in Africa. If you look at 8 AD, right? But the Christianity that was in Africa was in the northern part of Africa, right? And this is a time when the geography, of course, was also very different. So the Christianity that I speak of, which is still Christianity that came into West Africa, Nigeria, as we know it now, is that religion that brought in with itself, it brought in rules like homosexuality is a sin, abominations, this and that. I would argue anyway that if we look into the history of the Bible as a text, that we will see that many of the interpretations that we have of it today are at the best ambiguous, and at the worst they are incorrect, right? So I would say many of the people who are reading biblical texts today are reading them out of context without looking at the actual historical origins of what they are reading. And so I guess my only suggestion, because I would not be so arrogant as to say this is what you must do, but I would highly encourage all of us, as I encourage myself, to always read, to always think critically of whatever is put in front of you, because you might be surprised.
We're down to about 15 minutes, so I'll stop my questions and invite questions from the audience. Now, before I start taking questions, I just want to say you're only allowed one question, not like 3 questions in one like me. And then could you keep it short, because we are really almost out of time. So the guy waving, I've seen you.
Thank you. Chinelo, this question is for you. I mean, you sit there and you say that Christianity might not be true, but then we just we've just all watched the whole of the world, not just Nigeria. We've just all seen on Facebook Oyedepo's daughter performing a miracle that was recorded with such evidence.
Thank you for your observation.
The guy next to you.
Hello, name is Sada Malumfashi. So my question is,
it's for who?
To Chinelo Paranta. Okay. So when we said talking about your book, most of the time we dwell more on the thematic preoccupation more than the writing itself. So doesn't that make you grapple with the fact that are you a writer or an activist? That's it.
Thank you for the question.
Good question.
I am both, and it is okay. It is okay for people to look at the activist part of my book. That is fine, and in time you will see that there is also craft involved if you have not already seen it.
Any question for Panache?
Over there.
Okay, here first.
My name is Dada Olanipekun. Panache, this character called Titi, is it a Nigerian Titi or Zimbabwean Titi? And because I'm shocked a little bit. I'm shocked with Titi. Is there any bearing with the south, in the southwest of the country? In the southwest of Nigeria, is either Titi Layo, Titi Lokpe, Titi Shei, Titi blah 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 blah. You said you were influenced by the Nollywoods and all those kind of characters. Specifically, I want to know, which Titi are you talking about? Thank you.
This is quick. So very quick answer. Titi is a Shona name, and it's just Titi, meaning mercy. So God have mercy sort of thing. You know the writer Titi Dangarimboa, for example, that's a Shona name. So it's a very common name in Zimbabwe.
And it's spelled differently as well.
Oh, how do you spell it here?
T-I-T-I.
Oh, mine is T-S-I-T-S-I.
Another question for Panache. Panache, the guy at the back has been raising his hand. The guy at the back there. Very quickly, please.
All right. Not for Panache. This for Chinelo.
No. I want a question for Panache, please.
Okay.
Sorry, dude, but thank you, because I'm tired.
There's the lady here in front.
Thank you. Panache, you said when you were, initially, your focus was on religion when you were writing your book, right? and then you initially were judging Tsitsi. I want to know, like, how did you go through a process where by the end you were not judging Tsitsi? What happened?
This book was probably written over about 5 years, but not evenly, because sort of you start as a short story, leave it, come back, and whatever. And of course, particularly given my age, a lot of changes in my life, right? I think, so I started it when I was in the last year of my high school, so you can imagine sort of how naive I was before you get into the big wide world. And I think a lot of it has to also do with my politics changing, sort of coming into particularly black feminist thought, womanist thought, and understanding sort of what are the ways in which we survive tough circumstances, particularly as women, and according to the different degrees of marginalization or the different ways in which you're marginalized. So you're marginalized by the fact that, by your gender, you're marginalized by your race, you're marginalized by your class, you're marginalized by your sexuality, marginalized sometimes by your nationality or religion. And those were the things that I think there were ways in which I was very smug, because there's certain ways in which, in as much as I can talk about the ways in which I am marginalized, there's many ways in which I can be very privileged about my viewpoint, never having been someone who ever had to be wanting for anything, beyond sort of, oh, I would like an iPod, but really, never really having to worry about issues like school fees, never having to worry about looking after my parents and all of those kind of things. So then it becomes very easy to sort of look at someone and say, oh my God, why don't they just work hard? Why don't they just do X, Y, Z? And particularly, the kind of ideas about bootstrapping. So, we look at, almost poverty is a personal pathology. It's a moral, personal failing. And as I really sort of started to snap out of some of those things and realize, no, these are structural issues. These are things you're not going to bootstrap your way out of structural and economic and social issues. And there's ways in which I didn't see a lot of, I live in South Africa, so that's very much race focused. I didn't know there was feminisms where you could center both my race and my gender and my class and all the different ways in which we exist as full humans. And so because of that very narrow-minded view, I could be very sort of arrogant and decide, oh, how could so-and-so do X, Y, Z? How could you do 1, 2, 3? And now you sort of see how, very honestly, marriage is a tool of sort of economic leveling. There was a study, New York Times or something, that said, ever since men started marrying their equals, as they started marrying more and more their equals, as opposed to, let's say, your secretary, the rates of inequality have also started increasing, along with other sort of economic issues. But the idea being that there's a huge transfer of wealth. If you are a poorer woman, you marry a rich man, sometimes that's actually the surest way to succeed. And again, what are the ways in which women are excluded from the economy? So then if I'm excluded as a woman and I have to look in a very sexist, racist society, and I'm like, how am I going to get out of the situation? It's not going to be education. The surest thing is probably going to be sleeping with this man, so let me do what I need to do. Is that a bad thing? Whose failing was it? Was it her failing, or was it the structural failing? And that's the kind of thing that sort of helped me to sort of get out of that.
Any more questions? Yeah, for Chinelo. I'll take one more question, quickly. The guy I thwarted the last time. A short question, please.
Thank you. Very nice reading, and I enjoyed it so much. But I feel, or I have a different perspective from what you have, Chinelo, and I'd like you to react to this.
30 seconds, please.
Respond to this. Don't you feel the natural order of life, is against LGBT? Yes. And because the Bible says he made them male and female. Yes.
Okay.
Let me answer.
Yeah. I will. Yeah, over to you, Chinelo, if you wish to answer.
Okay. Well, there's not much else to say to answer your question, if that were indeed a question. But I'll just say I love the audience. I love you for your reaction. That's all.
Yes.
Can I just add
do we
something?
still-
Sorry,
Yeah.
I would just
Always
like
a
to.
man, right?
Yeah, I think it's also. I would also just like to say, panels, I always find them very interesting to watch because they're a reflection of our society, a little microcosm. So particularly when it's a little bit more demographically mixed, you also see the power dynamics here. And on the floor, we're seeing those those dynamics, and the bullying that's happening from the men in the audience, I think, is a lot of BS. And I think it's important to stand up and say no. To it. And we see that people are also egging each other on to ask questions in order to then put someone on a spot, and I think it's really unfair, and we need to call that out as well.
I mean, I will say in this audience, there are many people who found the question as ridiculous as the question is.
Yeah.
And so I think it is good to honor those people who see life for what life is.
Do we have more time, or do we have to wrap up? What? They say 2 minutes. I'll take one short question. One short question. Any female in the house? Any women? The woman there. She said 2 minutes.
It's now 1 minute and 30 seconds.
Yes.
My question is to both members of the panel, and it's to do with identity, because they both sort of talk about it briefly. Given the fact that identities are normally constructs, and they are fluid and changing in terms of if you situate them in history, there's no sort of one identity, and people build identities as they go along. How do you deal with this seeming contradiction when you're writing, particularly for those of you that are concerned about identities as constructed on the basis of we're Africans, but we're also Christians, we're also black, or we're also mixed race, and all of that?
Okay, so I've been instructed to keep my answer short. So I will say very briefly that I think we are at a time in history where we need to give ourselves and one another permission to be. We need to allow ourselves to talk about these things and have open conversations, but also with respect, right? And that's really, really all I can say to that, because that's a big question that you're asking.
30 seconds, then we have to go.
I think ultimately, if I'm just thinking of myself as an individual, us fighting a lot of these identity issues is a strategic essentialism, i.e., I would identify as black so that if in the future, I no longer have to be black, if you get what I mean. So I want it to be that it's immaterial. My blackness is as material as me being short or having long hair, you know, that kind of thing. And that's sort of what I hope to create by sort of forcing us into these conversations right now.
Thank you very much. A round of applause for our ladies. You have been great. Thank you very much. Good day.